Good morning. Buenos días. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marisol Viña. I am the Director of Public Affairs at the California Endowment, and I am excited to welcome you today to our Policy Perspectives webinar, What the Debt Ceiling Means for California. Policy Perspectives is a virtual space that brings together experts and partners to help us understand some of the state and federal policy issues that impact our state and our communities. These webinars are nonpartisan and non-political informational sessions, and I will note that there is no call to action as part of these webinars. So some of you may remember back in May, we heard a lot about how the federal government was close to reaching the debt limit, which would have led to an unprecedented default and the government being unable to pay for existing legal obligations. The negotiations between the president and Congress resulted in a deal to raise the debt ceiling and cut spending in order to avoid an economic crisis. Today's webinar will focus on sharing some key information about the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was the legislation passed with the various elements of the debt ceiling deal. We will talk about what it means for the communities that we serve, and though some of the impacts may not be felt immediately, we thought it would be a good idea to hear a little bit more about what exactly was in the deal. And while we will not cover everything in this webinar, we will focus on some of the elements of the legislation, including the spending caps, the changes to SNAP, and the impacts of some of the health-related programs, and what we might expect the impacts might be for California at the statewide and at the local levels. So now I am thrilled to introduce our program and our amazing speakers. To kick us off, we will hear from Michael Tora, who is Managing Director at the Raven Group. Michael will provide us a high-level overview of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, including some of the policy changes and how they will impact Californians, as well as some insight on what might be on the horizon. After that overview, we will hear from a familiar guest, Dottie Rosenbaum, who's a Senior Fellow and Director of Federal SNAP Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who is one of our longstanding federal partners. Dottie will cover the changes to CalFresh, our California SNAP program, and how they will affect Californians. After Dottie, we will welcome Angie Melton, who's Vice President of Nonprofit Practice at McAllister and Quinn, and she is joining us on behalf of the California Primary Care Association, another one of our amazing partners. Angie will discuss the impacts the deal will have at the local level, particularly on health-related funding, including community health centers, public health, and mental health. After the presentations, we will have time for Q&A, and we encourage you to post some questions in the chat, as we will try to get to as many of them as possible. And I also want to thank some of the early registrants who were able to submit questions in advance, as they really helped us shape today's conversation, and we will also try to answer some of those questions at the end. And lastly, a reminder that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available along with the slides, speaker bios, and additional resources after the event. All right, so now on to the program. I am happy to introduce Michael Tora.
Great. Thank you, Marisol. It's a pleasure to join you and our fellow speakers and everybody who's watching today. I will be honest here at the outset, unlike some of the other times that I've joined you on Policy Perspectives to talk about new laws. The one that we're talking about today, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, isn't all that wonderful. There's some good things about it, but then there's a lot of stuff that's really not great. But it's really important to know about it because of the impact that it's going to have here in California and across the country. So the Fiscal Responsibility Act is really the embodiment in law of the bipartisan deal that was reached in order to raise the debt ceiling. As Marisol explained, it was necessary to raise the national federal debt ceiling so that the federal government can continue to pay all of its financial obligations. The United States has always raised its debt ceiling in order to meet its obligations. It's never defaulted. And so, economic reverberations of defaulting would have been quite severe. And as with any economic crisis, the burden would fall mostly on lower middle income families and just further exacerbate inequality. So it's a good thing that the debt ceiling was raised. So here's just kind of the quick backstory on how we got to this particular debt ceiling deal. Back in the 2022 midterm elections, so just last year, as you probably know, there was a change in majority in the House of Representatives, and the new majority has very different priorities from the previous majority. They're really focused on cutting most categories of domestic spending, undoing policies that are meant to combat climate change, cutting taxes, among many, many other things. And the only way to, avoid the default was for Congress to act and pass, a law to raise the debt ceiling, which is nicknamed the must-pass piece of legislation, because most folks agree that it has to get done. But of course, the devil's in the details. And the new House majority, they knew that they'd never be able to get their bills with their top priorities passed through the Senate and signed by the president if they just move them on their own, right? Because the Senate majority and the president don't agree with those priorities. And so they saw the debt ceiling as an opportunity to have some leverage. They saw it as a way to extract some concessions and get their priorities passed into law. So they had a really long laundry list of things that they wanted in exchange for raising the debt ceiling. At the end of the day, the deal that was reached avoided most of their demands, but the White House did make some significant concessions. And that's how we ended up with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So let's talk about what's in it. We'll go to the next slide. So in addition to raising the debt ceiling, the new law includes a mix of budget and policy changes. So it makes changes to the work reporting requirements in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is known as SNAP or CalFresh in California. It also makes some changes to the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is known as CalWORKs in California. It streamlines energy infrastructure permitting by making changes to the National Environmental Policy Act, and it requires better coordination and use of technology to speed up the environmental review process. On student loans, the new law actually ends the current pause on student loan repayment on September 1st of this year, which was actually already the Biden administration's plan. So the law doesn't actually change much there. And then there's this new policy called administrative pay-go. I won't bore you with all the details. It's going to apply to any regulation that costs the federal government more than $100 million to implement. And the cost of those regulations would have to be offset by other spending reductions. But there's also a bunch of loopholes in the law. So we'll see over time what the real impact of this is going to be. On the next slide, you'll see some of the spending cuts, right? So the first one, the really big one, is that the law imposes caps on discretionary spending for the next 2 years. Discretionary spending is the category of federal spending that makes up roughly a quarter of federal spending every year. So it includes like everything that falls under the Defense Department, most education spending, all of our housing spending, a big chunk of infrastructure spending, but not necessarily all of it. And then a lot of spending on health programs fall under discretionary. But it does not include Medicaid, which funds Medi-Cal in California. It doesn't include the Affordable Care Act's subsidies for health insurance. So you don't need to worry about those being impacted. The law also takes back unspent COVID money. These types of cuts are called rescissions. Now, it doesn't take all of the unspent money. So, for example, the American Rescue Plan's local fiscal recovery funds that went to cities and counties won't be touched. And there's still going to be some money for things like vaccines and addressing certain health workforce shortages. And then the last significant part of the law is that it cuts some funding for the IRS, which means that this agency is going to have fewer resources to be able to conduct some of those complex audits that are needed in order to get wealthy individuals and corporations to actually pay the taxes they already owe. So if we go to the next slide, this gives you a sense of the budgetary impact of each of the bill's provisions. These circles are roughly drawn to scale So it's pretty obvious. I mean, some of these circles you can barely see. So it's pretty obvious that the most significant provision as it relates to the federal budget is the discretionary spending caps. I'll just say the thing I don't like about this slide is that the budget impact doesn't tell us the whole story, right? Where's the human impact? On this next slide, you'll see just a few examples of the many of the types of human impacts that this law is going to have. In my opinion, two of the policies with the most compelling potential human impacts are the spending caps and the changes to SNAP. SNAP because we're talking about the food that people need. And luckily, Dottie Rosenbaum's going to go into more detail on what those changes mean in a few minutes here. And then I think the spending caps matter because they're going to result in cuts to a lot of programs that we need here in California to help us advance equity. So let's talk more about these caps and how they're going to play out this year. So let's go to the next slide. Depending on whether you've maximized your screen, you may be able to see all the detail. And don't worry, this will be sent to you, this deck, so you can examine these numbers in more detail. But the debt ceiling deal, first of all, I should say, it didn't spell out the funding levels for every single program that the federal government funds, right? It just provided the spending caps for two big categories of discretionary spending, defense and non-defense. And so what's on this table is it shows how much each of these two categories are going to be getting. First, it shows how much they're being funded during the current fiscal year. Then we show the maximum level of spending that's allowed under the debt ceiling deal for the next 2 years. And then kind of in the middle there, we've got a column on what the spending level would be for this upcoming fiscal year if the new law's trigger goes into effect. Now, law has some triggers, like it triggers cuts to spending like 1% below current spending levels for both defense and non-defense spending. It's a mechanism that's meant to encourage both parties in Congress to cooperate and get the appropriations bills done on time. So that the triggers cuts go into effect temporarily if Congress doesn't complete its annual appropriations work by the end of this year. And then those cuts would become permanent if it doesn't complete the work 4 months later by April of next year, end of April next year. So you'll see that there's a steep cut in this chart in non-defense spending, nearly 9%. And that's a very significant cut for 1 year. However, as part of the deal that the president and the Speaker of the House reached, they agreed on some special provisions that make it possible to bring the funding level up for the non-defense programs up to a point where it's equal with the current fiscal year. Okay, so that funding would just stay flat rather than go down. So these special provisions, which I know some people just call them budget gimmicks, include things like redirecting the savings from those COVID rescissions back towards domestic spending, or the cuts to IRS's budget back to domestic spending. Okay. Now, the main takeaway from this slide, at least for now, is just to know that the best case scenario under this new law is that non-defense programs are going to get funded at the same level next year as they're being funded this year. And that the year after that, they'll get a little 1% increase. However, when you take inflation into account, I know inflation's come down a lot recently, but it still exists. So when you take that into account, freezing funding at current levels is actually really equal to a cut, right? Because costs are going up, but then the funding is remaining flat. So what this means is that federal programs won't be able to keep up with growing needs for the next 2 years. Here in California, we rely on federal funding to make up a large portion of the state budget. About 40-something% of the state budget actually comes from federal dollars. And many organizations, some of yours perhaps, directly apply to federal agencies for all sorts of competitive grants, right? And so under this law, those resources aren't going to go fast enough, aren't going to grow fast enough to keep pace with growing populations and rising costs. If we go to the next slide, this timeline just gives you a sense of what is ahead and some key dates. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but I just wanted to flag one danger on the horizon, which you can see with the big kind of red warning sign on there, and that's the risk of a partial government shutdown in October. Now, why a shutdown? And this isn't directly attributable to this new law, but it's really a reflection of the fact that the House and the Senate are developing very different appropriations bills. The Senate is generally adhering to the agreements that were in the debt ceiling deal. They're moving appropriations bills on a bipartisan basis. They're using those special provisions to make up for that difference for the non-defense programs so that they get funded at current levels. They're even finding some ways to include some small increases to a few programs here and there. Meanwhile, in the House, it's a completely different story. They're doing the opposite. They're ignoring the spending levels that were articulated in the debt ceiling agreement. They're actually imposing some deep cuts on domestic non-defense programs, cuts as deep as 30% in some cases. They're not using any of the special provisions to make up for the difference in non-defense spending levels. And they're stuffing their versions of the appropriations bill full of these extraneous and unfortunately, very partisan policy riders that would do things like restrict abortion access, ban pride flags on federal facilities, prohibit the administration from implementing its environmental justice initiatives, and more and more and more. So this means that the House and Senate are like on track for a collision course. They're going to face some really difficult negotiations because the House, at the end of the day, the House and Senate have to agree on a final funding plan for the next fiscal year in order for that to be signed into law. And the next fiscal year starts in just over 2 months. Now, Congress rarely meets this deadline, but they typically just buy themselves more time to negotiate by passing a short-term stopgap funding measure, and these are called continuing resolutions. And that just keeps the government operating at current levels. However, due to the internal politics within the House majority, it's going to be nearly impossible to pass one of these continuing resolutions before the end of September. And when Congress fails to do that, as has happened in the past, all the non-essential functions of the federal government are going to shut down. National parks will close, grant awards could be put on hold, public health activities like disease surveillance by the CDC will be suspended, and a lot more. Usually when there's a shutdown, there's so much public anger that those who are blocking the continuing resolution just give up, or congressional leaders find some way around them. So even assuming that we get over that hurdle, when you consider the differences between sort of the House funding levels and the Senate funding levels, it's not unreasonable to assume that the House is going to demand that the Senate come down a bit to meet the House somewhere in the middle. This wouldn't be great because that's going to mean funding cuts compared to this year. And Andrew will be speaking later on about what this is going to mean for community health centers here in California. But for now, now that I've laid this out for you, I'm going to actually pass it to Dottie Rosenbaum, who's going to educate us about the changes in the debt ceiling deal that are being made to SNAP.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Hi, everybody. Very happy to be with you today. I think you can go ahead and just put my slides up. I'll get right to it. I unfortunately have a lot to say, and I say unfortunate because, as Michael indicated, not necessarily happy things to talk about today. But if you just start with the first slide, I'll dig right in. I think there's a little bit of background that's needed. And of course, with my caveat in California always, CalFresh is called SNAP at the federal level. So I will be mostly calling it SNAP. And I apologize for my I guess it's whatever the opposite of parochial is, my national perspective on things. But so SNAP has a long-standing rule. It's been in effect since the late 1990s. It's sometimes called a work requirement. It's sometimes people will refer to this as an ABOD rule, which stands for able-bodied adults. I hate that with disabled children. More accurately, it's a time limit combined with a work reporting requirement. And so what it says is that adults who are between the ages of 18 and 49, who don't have children in their home and who are not disabled or don't have disabilities, are subject to a 3-month time limit in SNAP. They can receive SNAP for 3 months out of every 3 years, unless they are can document that they are working or participating in certain types of employment and training programs at least 20 hours a week. So this provision was suspended during COVID, and right now is coming back this month in many places. Not California, but in much of the rest of the country. The clock is ticking once again on this 3-month time limit starting in July. So just for context and framing, this group is not a large share of SNAP participants. Most SNAP participants are in families with children or else elderly or have disabilities, and most working age SNAP participants who can work do work. But SNAP is, in my view, our view, supposed to be there for people who need help affording food when they are in between jobs, or when they can't find a steady job of more than 20 hours a week, or if they have a physical or mental health condition that makes it difficult for them to work, but maybe doesn't rise to the level of receiving a disability benefit. So we and many others have long worked to reverse and mitigate this harmful and ineffective SNAP rule. And we were very disheartened that it was put on the table as part of the debt ceiling negotiations and that it ended up being included in the final bill. What was included in this bill has some positive features that will help some people that I'll get to in a second, but it still will take SNAP away from many, many people. And we are, again, deeply disappointed that it was included in this bill. Next slide, please. So let me quickly explain some terminology around this harsh rule, because it has waivers and 2 types of exemptions, and it can get a little bit tricky to distinguish. So under the SNAP statute, areas with relatively high unemployment, as is defined in regulation, can apply for waivers for areas, and their states can apply for waivers for areas of their state, or when employment is especially high, for statewide waivers. So the reason I say this is not coming back in California is that California has a statewide waiver until October of 2024 at least. The second type of exemption applies to individuals who meet certain categories. So pregnant people, college students who are in school more than half time, and these are just examples. People who are caring for an incapacitated person, those people are not subject to it. And then the last kind of exemption are individual exemptions that are discretionary for state use. States receive a capped number of these individual exemptions each year that they can use and apply to any person who would otherwise be subject to the time limit. And for many, many years, states have been able to carry unused exemptions forward. So the 2 places where I put asterisks is what I'm going to talk about with respect to where the debt ceiling bill changed it. But before I do that, I just want to be clear, there is extensive research on this provision over the many years it's been in effect that shows that it just simply takes food assistance away from people and makes it harder for them to work. There is no evidence that it helps people, helps them find jobs, or increases their earnings, despite the fact that this is what many proponents argue. And the small charts you probably can't see, except that you can see that there's a steep drop, is sort of what I wanted you to see. These are 3 states that re-implemented this shows the drop in the number of SNAP participants the last time they re-implemented the time limit after Congress suspended it during the Great Recession. So we just put out a paper last week estimating that at least 500,000 people and perhaps closer to 1 million people will be cut from SNAP in the next few months as the time limit comes back in most states. Okay, so next slide, please. So the change in who is subject to this work reporting requirement or time limit, basically in the debt ceiling bill, the time limit will now, under this bill, it will now apply to people up until their 55th birthday rather than their 50th birthday, as has been the case for many years. So that increase phases in over a couple of years, but by the time California is implementing this provision, the age will have gone all the way up to 55 on your 55th birthday through age 54. Next slide, please. And then the other change in the bill is to add new exemptions for people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are veterans, and youth who have aged out of foster care up until through age 24. So these are really great, important exemptions, and time will tell how well they will be implemented by different states. These are not questions that most states ask now about SNAP recipients. So there will be some implementation issues about how, and verification issues and questions about how somebody, how states screen for these exemptions and how somebody can identify themselves as fitting into one of these categories. So sort of the proof is in the pudding in terms of how many people will actually benefit from this change. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. I think we may have lost Dottie. Apologies about that. I hope she can rejoin us in a minute. But while we wait, we're going to go ahead and keep moving and see if we can continue with Angie's presentation. Again, apologies. We seem to have some technical difficulties. Go ahead, Angie. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angie Melton. I'm going to talk about community health centers and other health programs and the impact of the debt ceiling deal on those items. So can you start my slides, please? All right, next slide. So I'm talking about health centers first, and I will get into what the budget situation this year does to them, but I want to set the stage for kind of challenges overall. First one is just inflation. Michael talked about this earlier. There's a higher cost of doing business. It's improving a little bit, but it still costs more to run businesses and, to run health centers. There are also wage pressures. The good job market has meant that there are higher wages. People are demanding higher wages. They can get jobs elsewhere. And so health centers have really had to increase their wages, which just is another higher cost. Another issue is Medicaid redeterminations. As we know, at the end of the public health emergency, states have started going through the Medicaid rolls and making redeterminations. California has a lengthy plan. Hopefully it will not be as draconian as it is in other states, but still is likely that there will be people who will no longer be eligible for Medicaid for a variety of reasons. And they might actually lose Medicaid coverage even if they're eligible, but because of change in address, just a ton of reasons that people could lose eligibility. When a patient goes to a community health center, they provide services, whether they can, no matter what the insurance is and no matter whether they, what they can afford to pay. So if somebody comes in and they're not covered by Medicaid and they do self-pay, there's a sliding fee scale. And so they will pay a very low amount for care. And it just changes what health centers are able to recoup in terms of the costs when they're providing care. The other piece, expiration of COVID relief funding. Health centers got some additional funding during the pandemic because they were dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of extra costs, a lot of situations where they needed additional funding. That COVID relief funding helped them somewhat with the wage pressures I was talking about earlier, because they were able to provide bonuses, potentially salary increases. But with that funding running out, health centers have to figure out a way to make up the gap. The last budget challenge are changes to the 340B program. In Medicaid in California, the Medi-Cal RX program changed what health centers are able to recoup. They no longer are able to recoup any 340B savings via the Medicaid program. And in Medicare program, they can still participate in 340B, but there are a bunch of manufacturer restrictions being put in place, which have meant that health centers are more limited in the 340B savings that they can access. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage for these are just budget challenges that health centers are ongoing right now, completely separate from any kind of budgetary situation that's happening this year at the federal level. Next slide, please. So, and here's a breakdown of health center funding. So the largest percentage of operating costs come from reimbursements, which are controlled by funders. That's, the state, federal government, insurance, contracts. That's, largely out of the control of the health centers as to what their reimbursements are. And for the most part, they do not pay their full costs. We know that Medicaid reimbursements are historically low. It's hard for health centers to make it on just their reimbursements. The 330 grant is, it's named a bunch of different things, but the 330 grant is what health centers get, which it kind of helps them be able to treat everybody. The sliding fee scale, all of the things that they're able to do is because they have this extra grant money so that they can treat all comers. Is a smaller percentage of funding. I spoke with a health center yesterday. Their grant makes up less than 10% of their funding. I found out, I'll show you in a minute, that the average overall is about 13% of health center funding comes from their grant. So it's, not insignificant, but it's a smaller percentage. And then other, it's, 340B, state and foundation grants, other federal grants, kind of anything they can find to make ends meet. Okay, next slide. So this is a beautiful pie chart that was put together for me by my friends at the National Association of Community Health Centers. And this is a really, the words might be a little hard for you to see on the screen, but if the big blue, this is average over the whole country, so it's not specific to California. The big dark blue is Medicaid revenue. The lighter blue is Medicare, and the little tiny sliver of blue is other public payer. And then the green is private third-party payers. So if you look at that, that's a pretty big chunk of health center revenue. The yellow is the 330 grant, which we were talking about a minute ago. That's an important chunk to remember. Look at what a big piece of the pie that is. And then the other colors are the other kind of that I was talking about, federal grants. Some of this is COVID money because this was from 2021. So this is just a visual for you to look at the breakdown. Next slide, please. So the 330 grant has an interesting history. Prior to the Affordable Care Act, the 330 grant was just funded in the annual discretionary appropriations process. That's the budget caps that Michael was talking about earlier for annual non-defense discretionary. And then the Affordable Care Act added money to the health center fund so that they could start covering all the additional people that were going to be included in Medicaid once you had the Medicaid expansion. And also just generally speaking, added money because they wanted to provide primary care access to as many people as possible. So there was this health center fund, and then that was for 5 years. And then since then, it's been extended a couple of times. And that mandatory funding, the orange on this chart, actually expires at the end of the year. The blue is annual discretionary. So at the end of the fiscal year, both the orange and the blue expire and have to be extended in one way or another for health centers to continue to function. So the main point I want to make about this is that we have a real, it's a very tense time because of the debt ceiling, package. And because of this real insistence from the House Republicans that they don't want to spend additional money, there has long been bipartisan support for health centers. We do think that there's a way forward on achieving this mandatory funding. They've talked about legislation. There's legislation that's been passed out of committee. So they do think it can happen, but the situation is very tense because there's this constant concern about spending. So with the combination of all of this grant funding that that could expire at the end of the fiscal year, health centers are certainly nervous about how that's going to work. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about a couple of other pieces that were included in the debt ceiling. And workforce is a really big one. Some of the COVID funding that was clawed back in, that was a rescission in the debt ceiling bill, was the National Health Service Corps. The National Health Service Corps provides loan repayment to doctors and nurses and other providers who work in underserved areas. There was a big chunk of extra funding for the National Health Service Corps included in one of the COVID relief bills. There was an intention for that money to be spent out over several years, and a lot of that was clawed back. So there is not that additional funding that can be allocated for physicians to work in underserved areas. The National Health Service Corps also has a mandatory component, and that is on the same funding schedule as the health center mandatory. So that needs to be adopted by the end of the fiscal year for those programs to continue. Another issue is that behavioral health providers are in quite short supply. There's a lot of effort in California to provide additional access to behavioral health. That the access is amazing, but there are not providers there to be hired by health centers, to be hired by public health departments. And solutions to the workforce problems, they cost money. And so if we have flat funding, or as Michael alluded to, the likelihood of maybe small cuts in all of these programs, those are not going to actually provide solutions to the workforce problems or to any of the health care issues that we have today. Next slide, or I think that might be my last one. It is. All right, Marisol, back to you.
Thank you so much, Angie, for helping level. So I am pleased to report that we have Dottie back on screen. So we're gonna allow her to finish the rest of her presentation. Welcome back, Dottie.
Woo, I'm so sorry about that. My computer just restarted and got a big jolt of adrenaline. So if I start talking fast, that's why. So I think I was on the slide where we were talking about, I had just talked about the new exemptions for individuals experiencing homelessness, veterans, and former foster youth. And then I was going to talk about the impact on 50 to 54-year-olds, which was saying that how well the exemptions get implemented, time will tell, but it's quite certain that the 50 to 54-year-olds will be cut off if they cannot document that they are working a certain number of hours or that they qualify for exemptions. So qualify for one of the other exemptions. We have estimated that there's 750,000 individuals nationwide who are at risk of losing benefits in this 50 through 54-year-old range, of whom about 118,000 in 2019 were in California. And that's the number in that age range with no children in their home and no disability benefits. Again, if they can show that they are working or exempt or meet one of the new exemptions, then they would not lose. But that is the number of people who would have to deal with the burdens of complying with the provision, who states would have to seek out who would have to monitor and track whether they are working or meet an exemption. So that bigger number is quite large. And what the chart to the right shows is sort of by age, how much more likely low-income older adults are to face health conditions that are barriers to work compared to both lower income adults who are in that age range, higher income adults who are in that age range, and the younger, lower income adults, right? So as one ages, not surprisingly, there are more barriers that people face to being able to work. And often they may be able to work, but not in the same job that they worked on earlier in their careers, right? They may have had jobs that involved working, using their bodies in physical ways that they're no longer able to do. And so they need more than 3 months to be able to retrain or to even look for and find another job. Okay, so next slide. So there's two other provisions of the debt ceiling bill that affect the options that states have. The first is that the geographic waivers will continue, but USDA is required to report on state waiver requests. This shouldn't affect California, at least not in your current administration, but there are several states where they've applied for waivers under the radar for many, many years, and now that will be more public, and we're very concerned about states no longer applying for waivers for areas that have high unemployment and insufficient jobs. And then the second one is those individual hardships exemptions that I talked about a few minutes ago, or I guess now more like 20 minutes ago, which are based on where USDA assigns states these exemptions, and one exemption is equal to 1 month of additional eligibility. Under the debt ceiling bill, those exemptions will be reduced, and the rather large backlog of exemptions, because states have been allowed to carry them forward over time, will be eliminated at the end of fiscal year 2025. So more on that in a minute, but I just wanted to get those two things out there on the table. This next slide is about the timeline, and we can just sail right through it because the timeline for the rest of this year in the states that are implementing it is very short and very confusing. But in California, we don't need to worry about that because you have a statewide waiver and it won't go into effect until next year. So I just wanted to show you that because it made me happy to realize we didn't have to worry about that. Okay, next slide, please. So just quickly, I want to flag a few implementation and advocacy opportunities. These are all things that we are working on at the national level. We expect the Department of Agriculture to put out more guidance. And again, the good news is that by the time this comes back in California, that guidance will be out. There'll be experience, we'll have a little bit more under our belt. There's a lot that's going on right now. But in terms of, you have a year or a little more than a year at least before this comes back. I think that time will go very quickly. So I just wanted to flag some of these opportunities. First, the best way to protect people is to continue the area waivers. And it's unknown what areas will continue to qualify in California after October 2024. It's unlikely that the state will continue to qualify for a statewide waiver. It depends on economic conditions. Things can change. We won't know until late in 2024. Some of you may remember, who follow CalFresh, that prior to the pandemic, the time limit was coming back in California after the Great Recession and had, I think, been implemented in 3 states and was about to be implemented in a number more, 3 counties, and was about to be re-implemented in more. And then the pandemic came along. So I wouldn't be surprised if that plays out again this time, that there will continue to be areas that qualify for waivers, but it won't be statewide. Second question is, will the state use those individual exemptions? If the time limit does come back for some counties in October of 2024, California has almost 1 million exemptions that will be expiring by the end of September of 2024, and they'll go away. They won't be there anymore on October of 2025. So it seems likely that the state officials could use those exemptions to either continue to exempt the balance of the state that it doesn't qualify for the waiver, or certainly, depending again on how many areas qualify for the waiver, for substantial numbers of people when the time, and delay the reimposition of the time limit that way. Next slide. I think this is my last slide. But eventually, unfortunately, unless we change the law, which is certainly on our list as a high priority, but eventually the time limit will come back. There's this question of how would somebody find out that they should be exempt, right? It's important, very important, to properly screen people, to provide them with clear notices that the time limit's applying to them. And then especially for these, I mean, for all people who are subject to the provision, but especially for these new exemptions, there's the opportunity to collaborate with the service providers who serve homeless individuals experiencing homelessness, veterans, and foster care youth who have aged out of foster care, or young adults who have aged out of foster care, to inform them that they could be eligible for an exemption, that they should still apply for SNAP or CalFresh. And then, as I said, the screening, the state will need to develop procedures for obtaining the information, for properly screening people, for outreach to them to make sure they know that they're eligible, and then for figuring out how to limit the burden on the individual to prove that they fall into one of these categories. So I think I'll stop there. And again, I'm so sorry for the interruption and my brief departure from the meeting.
No worries, Dottie. Thank you. We're just glad that you were able to join us again. Thank you for that great presentation. Thank you, Angie, and thank you, Michael. That was just such great information. Let's bring everyone back on screen because we do have some questions for our speakers. We have, I know we had one in the chat from Sarah regarding the exemption after October 2024, and Dottie, you have addressed that. And so thank you for responding to that question. And so we have, looks like my screen is black, but I hope you can hear me okay. So I'm going to go ahead and moderate the Q&A section. So we do have a question, and these were submitted in advance, as I mentioned earlier. So Maribel from the Inland Empire Equity Partnership asked, how does this impact the affordable housing funding? Michael, might you be able to take that question?
Yeah, sure. So there's nothing in the deal or in the Fiscal Responsibility Act specifically about housing, right? There's no special provisions, no carve-outs or exemptions or anything. So, and because the funding for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is what the department that administers all federal housing programs, that is subject to discretionary funding, or they receive their funds through the discretionary portion of the federal budget. So they're going to be subject to that whole caps mechanism that I explained, right? They're going to be caught up in all of that. And we just got yesterday, the House Appropriations Committee just approved the bill for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so, and includes deep cuts. Of course, we're going to have to see what happens on the Senate side. So unfortunately, we're looking at that same dynamic where best case scenario is that the federal funding levels for housing programs will be just flat, the same as they are this year, or we could be seeing a bit of a cut.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, and then we also, since we're talking about housing, we also have a question from Rafael from the San Diego Tenants Union. And he is asking what housing solutions are part of the deal and how do they address housing inflation?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same answer, unfortunately, right? Again, nothing special in the deal for affordable housing. And that point about inflation, I mean, actually, this deal does the exact opposite of addressing inflation, right? Because normally to address inflation, we increase our discretionary spending by a certain amount every year, right, to keep pace. But this deal does the opposite. And so we're actually going to be falling behind in terms of keeping up with inflation.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Angie, we do have a question. Let's shift gears a little bit from housing and let's get back to California funding. Tim Ryan from the North Coast Clinics Network is wondering, how does this impact California's budget deficit? Will any federal dollars offset California funds?
Muted. Okay. Unfortunately, it's not going to affect the budget deficit. We're not going to get any funding that's going to offset the budget deficit. We can't expect additional funding. I think during a couple of years of COVID, there was additional funding for states and localities that helped deal with some of the funding issues, but there's actually nothing in this deal that's going to help with that budget deficit.
Thank you. And another question for you, Angie. Tracy from Public Health Alliance was asking, how is public health funding impacted and what are projected impacts on communities?
So I think this is really similar to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the budget pressures on health centers. The budget pressures on public health agencies are very similar in that there was some additional funding during the pandemic that flowed down through the state and through localities that helped with public health issues. That funding is basically used up. There's no more of that. And with all of the various accounts in annual discretionary appropriations flat funded, it basically doesn't account for inflation, and it doesn't really account for any kind of preparation for future pandemics. If we have another bad RSV year, public health agencies don't have any extra money to prepare for that. There is a process right now going through the House and Senate. That's a pandemic preparedness bill that could include some provisions that could help with public health agencies' preparedness for the future, but it doesn't look like they're going to spend a lot of money in that bill.
Great. Thanks, Angie. Dottie, let's get back to you for a quick minute. And I should have given you an opportunity if you want to say more a little on the exemption question. But if not, so that's one. And then two, there's also a question from Erin Kunst with the Center for Healthy Communities. And continue. Can you hear me okay?
Now we can. You went out for a little while.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me repeat that. So the question is, how do we engage in uplifting programs such as SNAP that continue over and over again to show significant return on investment, boost the economy, and lift people out of poverty?
Well, that's a great question. I couldn't agree with your description of what SNAP does or CalFresh does. And I think spreading the word about that, right, is what we need to do. There's a lot of people who don't understand the important impact and the important role that SNAP plays and other programs like it. And so educating the public, educating the yeah, I mean, I guess I would defer to others on sort of the local conditions and the kinds of things that are needed in California. But I can certainly say in Washington, there's a lot of need for additional education of people about the important role that SNAP plays in improving health, in improving all sorts of outcomes, employment outcomes. There's lots of great research on all of that.
The importance of storytelling and people that are directly impacted by the programs. It's just really important to get your voices heard out there in terms of what impact these programs are having in your lives, in your communities.
Thank you, Marisol. Yes, that's a very good point. And I think especially the breadth of the reach that SNAP has over the course of time, right? That many people have used SNAP, have had SNAP help them put, or food stamps as it was once known, or Fresh as it's known in California, for various periods in their lives. And I think there's a misunderstanding about that, right? That there's a lot of stereotypes and stigma that is, again, misinformation. And so having people speak to their personal experience to the extent that they're comfortable doing so is really helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Dottie, for that. Okay, let's shift gears. We probably have time for 2 more questions, but let's take this other question from Isai Garnica with Valley Onward. And that question is, how will this impact education funding? Michael, you briefly mentioned it, but is there something more to say on education funding? And probably a whole other webinar, but a brief response to that.
Again, caught up in that same dynamic, right? It's education funding it's mostly falls in that discretionary category, the sort of non-defense discretionary. And again, the House has come out with its proposed funding levels and approved that through committee. We're expecting the Senate to do so next week. The House actually cuts education programs by a whopping 29% below current funding levels. And that includes cutting what's known as Title I, which is the basically funds for high poverty schools, by like $14.7 billion. And so for California, this could mean a cut of about $1.6 billion. So it would have a massive impact on things like teacher quality, services for multilingual learners, preschool development grants, so much more. But again, we'll see what the Senate comes out with. I expect they'll have a much higher number, so we won't have to face those draconian cuts. But again, the House is probably going to demand, if the House is here and the Senate is here, probably end up somewhere in the middle, and that could still be a cut compared to where we are this year, unfortunately.
Okay. Anyone wanted to add anything on that question? Okay. All right. So let's go to this last one. So Nicholas Phillips with Equality California asks, are we anticipating that new federal grants will be placed on hold from 2023 to 2025?
I'm happy to jump in if others want to.
I can.
Yeah, Angie, I don't know if it's specific to health centers or more broadly.
Well, I mean, I can talk about grants kind of generally. What I'd say is grants are on a little bit of a delayed cycle. So we have a number of grants that will be coming up in 2023 that were funded over the last several years. There's actually a fair amount of grant money in the environmental space that's just rolling out now from the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. So there's still grants like that. Social services grant programs, I don't think we're going to expect there to be a hold necessarily, but you could see smaller dollar amounts depending upon what the final budget numbers come out in 2024 and 2025, those numbers could be lower. There could be smaller awards or a smaller number of grants, just because, as we've been talking about, flat funding or slight reductions, that happens across the board in all of these discretionary programs.
Yeah, and I'll just note that I totally agree with everything Angie just said, and that there are some grant programs that are getting mandatory funding, right? So that's not impacted by these caps. So, for example, some of the environmental justice grant programs that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act, they're not going to be impacted. With infrastructure, it's kind of a mixed bag. Kind of like some of them are impacted by the discretionary caps, and some of them are actually mandatory. So those will still go through. So yeah, but like Angie says, it's not like everything's going to be on hold. It's just the amounts for some of these programs may be lower.
Great. Well, I think that's all that we have time for. We want to appreciate all the great questions that were submitted. We have more, but we don't have time to get to all of them. Deep appreciations, Dottie, Michael, Angie, for these great conversations, great insight. And it's giving us, just additional information for us to take into account as we, do our work day to day. Thank you to our audience. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here today, and also the work that you do day in and day out on behalf of our communities. And we do want to hear from you. So on the screen, you're going to see a QR code that we'd like for you to scan and fill out a survey about today's webinar, and also give us ideas for future webinars. As a reminder, we will be sharing the slide decks, bios, the recordings, and resources with all of you tomorrow. Thank you so much, and we really hope to see you at our next Policy Perspectives webinar. Have a good day. This concludes our program.